Okay, I wanted to share some ideas that I've had about the way therapy has evolved over time, and wanting to make some links between the way therapy is, the form that it takes at a particular time in our history, and what's going on in the world, what's going on in society in a more general sense, and wanting to make a link between those two with the idea that the kind of therapy that is current grows out of the soil of the culture that it's in. So if we look at 100 years ago, back at the beginning of the 20th century, we see that archaeology was at its height. People were digging up the past, trying to find what had happened that led up to us being how we are. So digging up the past archaeologically was the go. Also, there were dictators, there were kings, there were kingdoms, there were empires, British Empire, this empire, that empire. And at least in the West, there was a very strong hierarchical structure in the family where the man was the head of the household, or at least so that how it appeared, and children should be seen and not heard. And so there was the power structure was very much hierarchical, very much top-down, very much very considerable vertical process. And life was rather leisurely. Horse and cart, cars were starting to come into being, and the work lanes, but they were pretty slow. And in that culture, in that soil, we had the psychoanalytic approach come from Freud, where he was assuming that if we dig up the past, then we will find out something about how come we are where we are now. There was very much a hierarchical process in psychodynamic approach, where the analyst would be the one saying when and what termination should happen, and if someone decided that they were ready to finish earlier, well, that's actually an indication for more treatment. Flight into health, it was called. And there was plenty of time. You could have an hour every day for weeks, for months, for years, and that was the process of therapy. Now, mind you, this is a potted version. Obviously, it's not accurate. It's just some reflections that might be of some relevance to us. Now, if we jump 50 years, middle of the century, in the 50s, we have the bomb. So in that culture, the past was had let us down. It was irrelevant. It had led up to the dilemma of the bomb. And of course, with the bomb, everyone could be annihilated at any moment, so there was no focus on the future. All we have is the present moment. Also, empires had dispersed, kings were rare, dictators were on the way out. There wasn't that there weren't any, but there was a move towards a more democratic process in the world as far as power is concerned. In the family, parents would ask their children to call them by their first name, so that there was an evening out of power structure, and things were speeding up. We had jets, we had telephones, we had television. The pace of society had increased. And in this environment, we had Gestalt, where if anyone has had any training in Gestalt, you always know, because their favourite question when they're stuck is, what's happening now? And the process of Gestalt assumes that the past is relevant only as far as there's some unfinished business. So anything in the past is a limitation, it's brought into the present so the Gestalt can be complete, and then that's it. There's no interest in the future, no need to, because the assumption is that if we take care of the past, we can be present, and that's enough. Gestalt therapists were inclined to ask their clients to call them by their first name. There was an evening out of the power structure in the whole therapeutic process, and the counselling process went along by negotiation. It was much speedier. There was no need for years of therapy. It was relatively brief. A handful of sessions would be sufficient, and then a client could get on with their own lives. Now, if we make another leap, another 50 years to the end of the 20th century, we see that the whole world is speeding up. It's escalating at an escalating rate. The power structure has now been inverted. So instead of parents telling what their children what to do, towards the end of that century, children were basically inclined to tell their parents what they were not going to do. And so it was a child-driven family, child-centred family structures, and the whole business environment is to do with customer satisfaction. The customer is always right. 100 years previously, you could have any coloured car you wanted as long as it was black. At the end of the 20th century, you could choose what shade of black you wanted: the front, top, back, bottom, inside, external, seats, whatever other colour you wanted in any combination. So it was a customer-driven process, and so in that environment we had the solution approach where a solution therapist would say, well, what would you like to achieve today? It was customer-driven, and instead of having years or months or even weeks of therapy, often one-off therapy was the go. Maybe a follow-up, maybe a couple of follow-ups, but very brief. So the power structure had been now the customer is running, what would have been the underling is now running the show. They have the power, and things have speeded up, and that is the way that therapy was happening. Now we're moving into the 21st century. What's going on? If we look around the globe, we can see a number of different trends happening. There's a whole range of things, but just for this exploration, I'm wanting to say that there's a tendency towards homogenisation. Everything has to be the same. I was just listening to a talk where a woman brought up in Europe said that people that she grew up with would rather be fruit salad rather than marmalade. But these days everyone's put into the blender. We all have to conform to a certain standard. And we have, it looks to me like a return of the power of the institution rather than individual. It's a homogenised, globalised institution. And everything has to be accountable, financially usually. So it's a business, homogenised, accountable world that we're living in, and it's increasingly impersonal, so that you ring up about your telephone or some service and you get some message. You've got to go through about 17 layers of, for this option press that, for that option press something else, before you actually get to speak to a person, if at all. So we see that increasingly therapy these days is manualised, is standardised, and therapists have to be accountable. Accountable to whom? For what? But that's the managed care accountability issue that therapy is now growing up in. It's now emerging from, growing out of that. Now, making all these comments, I don't want to sound like they're true, they're just thoughts. And the purpose of me speaking about this is not so much to be accurate as to give us an opportunity to observe the way the world is and you can observe the way the world is from your eyes. I'm just giving my opinion. And to then have some kind of prediction, some kind of readiness to where therapy is and where therapy might be evolving, so that if we see the way culture, the way our society is evolving, that'll give us some clues about what direction a therapy is likely to take. And that gives us a chance to adapt or not, because it's not that everything has to fit in with the way things are now. There are still people who wear wind-up watches, and why shouldn't they? So I hope that all of this rambling makes some kind of connection and can be some help to you to see where you are and where you're going in relation to where the world is.